guess you've asked me to tell the story of this young one's Robert James Rogers was my grandfather. That's who this is named after, this young man.
You're going to talk louder.
This young man is Robert James Donaldson III. My name is Robert James Donaldson, and I named my son Robert James Donaldson II. And we're all named after my grandfather, who was Robert James Rogers. Robert James Rogers, as I remember him as a young man growing up, he died when I was a young kid in South Carolina with a heart attack. And he was called Robbie, Mr. Robbie, in the little town of Blenheim, South Carolina. The way that Blenheim, South Carolina got its name was that my family inherited land years ago from the castle of the Duke of Marlborough and the castle of Blenheim. And so Blenheim, South Carolina is in Marlborough County. And we inherited land because of my ancestors were traders. And because of trading, then that was given to my family.
What was your grandfather called?
Mr. Robbie. And Mr. Robbie back there was very noted for being an honest man, and what he said, you could take his word as the gospel, as the truth. He made deals just by his word. He married my grandmother, who was Ida Townsend. I think the last name was Townsend. I'll have to look into that. And they had 5 children. Of the 5 children, only 2 lived, which was my mother, which was Mary Rebecca Donaldson, was Mary Rebecca Rogers. And then when she married my dad, it was Mary Rebecca Rogers. And my dad is John Robinson. You're getting these names all mixed up. John Robinson Donaldson. Which also is interesting because 2 families that went together.
See, you can just keep going.
Yeah, 2 families that went together always said they would name the firstborn after the other family. And that's how my dad got his name, and that's how my older brother got his name. So, my grandfather, Mr. Robbie, married Ida Townsend. And there were 4 sisters in the family that he married into.
You didn't finish telling me that.
Uncle Bubba.
Uncle Bubba, you didn't finish telling me that.
Well, I said there were 2 of them. There was Uncle Bubba
That lived.
and there were actually 5 children,
said that.
and all of them died, including my grandfather's namesake, who was Robert James Rogers, who, as a young kid of about 5 years of age, died of dysentery.
Three of them died. No,
3 of them
not
died. No, 5. 3 of them died. Thank you.
You said they all did.
The 2 that lived were,
Well, here I am. I'm
grandma.
thinking this off the top of my head.
He just turned 50 though.
Yeah, that's right. You just turned 50.
Just turned
so.
50.
Yeah, the 2 that lived.
were grandma and Uncle Bubba.
Uncle Bubba. That was your grandmother, my mother,
Right.
and Uncle Bubba. Uncle Bubba's my uncle.
It's called
Yeah.
Uncle Bubba, but his name is actually Bob Rogers.
It's actually Bob Rogers.
And is he Robert James Rogers? Do you know?
No, I think it's Robert.
Something else.
I'm not sure what it is. It's not Robert James Rogers, though. Because the one that was my father's namesake, my grandfather's namesake, died. The son did. And what is interesting is that according to my uncle now, going to my uncle,
Robert Townsend Rogers.
Robert
His
Townsend.
Uncle Bubba's. That's what it says.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And that's where the Townsend comes from, which is on my
Grandmother's.
grandmother's side, right?
So then the Robert James Rogers that died at 5, and he was a junior then, or a second.
I think he was the second.
He was Mr. Robbie's son.
Mr. Firstborn son. In those days, there were a lot of deaths from young kids being born. Look at that brown. So, Then my uncle, he had 2 children. And what I said is interesting about him was that he was raised, and so was my mom, were raised where they had to dress up every Sunday, and they had tea with all the local people around there, and there was a lot of pressure put on them to conform. And both of them basically became nonconformists. My uncle, who was raised in a domineering household, according to him, my grandfather would not show a lot of love towards him because he had put so much love to his other children that he had lost, that he was really scared to put a lot of love to them, because of the fact that if he did and then they died, it would just tear him apart. So when I was born and I was his namesake, I was his boy, and there was a lot of love and affection put towards me, which in some ways make my uncle jealous. And because my uncle was raised in a female-dominated home, then he feels that's the reason why he became homosexual. Well, that's what he feels.
So when did Mr. Robbie pass away? When you were how old?
I was, Mr. Robbie passed away when I was about,
Magic.
I don't know, see, I was a young kid. I
So
guess
that was after you had moved back to South Carolina, or were you up in Ventura?
we were still in South Carolina. When my dad used to have his own plumbing company. My dad went bankrupt, and so when I was in the 1st grade, we moved back to South Carolina. We moved back there. We lived in South Carolina from the 1st grade, from then the 1st grade through the 6th grade.
During
No, I
that time?
guess through the 7th grade. Back there for 5 years.
During that time when you passed away?
I can remember very clearly.
Tell us squirrel story. And tires.
The squirrel story.
And tires.
Rocky, was that Rocky?
Oh, when we moved out, well, first of all, let me tell you some things about living back there. My brother and I can remember my grandfather taking us down and showing us how to fish, and getting us cane poles, and us going back there with the old bobber and fishing back there. I can remember also my grandfather one time, we told my grandfather we wanted BB guns, and we lived with my grandfather and grandmother in their home there in Blenheim, South Carolina, which is an old southern home that was way high up off the ground that you could crawl underneath, and had a porch all the way around it. And we told my grandfather that we wanted BB guns, and I remember my mom telling my grandfather, Dad, that if you find BB guns, they'll shoot holes in all these screens. And my grandfather said, well, they're not screens. So that afternoon he went to town and he bought us BB guns and brought them back to us. Sure enough, we shot holes in all the screens. But that's what we used to run around down there all the time in the swamps and just do a lot of fishing that my grandfather taught me how to do, and just be kids. Build rafts and go swimming, throw in rocks to scare away the water moccasins so that we could swim. Gotta try that sometime. Then dive in. Always barefoot. Anyway, so then my grandfather died, and so we moved back to California. When my dad went bankrupt, they put a lien on everything he owned, so that's the reason why we moved to South Carolina. We had no choice. And so my dad came back out here and got a job and bought a house in Casita Springs, and then came back after 5 years. Came out here and got the job after 5 years, and he wasn't out here for 5 years. And then came back, and we moved out here to California. When we moved out, we had a 1947 GMC pickup truck, half-ton, with 2 tons on it. It was pulling a trailer with 3 tons on it. And we had a 1949 Hudson with that was pulling a trailer with another 1.5 tons to 2 tons on it. And we moved all the way from South Carolina to California. We had 23 blowouts all the way. My dad bought brand brand new Sears tires on all the rigs before we left, and every time they blew out, we'd unhook the trailer from the car and we'd drive into town and get new tires. They honored their guarantees. When we got out in California here, my dad went in to buy new tires, and Sears wouldn't sell him any new tires because they had his name. That's a true story. And we moved to South Carolina. We looked like the grapes of wrath. We even had the squirrel tied on the back of the trailer behind the car. We had a pet tree squirrel named Mickey that my dad picked up when he was working down in the swamps on a D8, I guess, Caterpillar for the lumber companies pushing over trees. Brought it home, and my sister raised it, and we raised that up as a pet. He moved out to California with us. So we came back out here. Moved to Cedar Springs, and that's where we live. Since that time, my mom and uncle have sold the part of the plantation that they had back there because they inherited 1/4 of it from my great-grandfather, I guess. And they were the first generation that could sell it, so they sold that. The plantation home that was back there that has something like 23 or 25 rooms in it has since deteriorated. It went to my Uncle Johnny, who was the first male in the family, and that's who it was supposed to go to. It's still back there, still standing, but it's in pretty bad shape. Last time my dad went back there, he went by it, and there was this couple that was trying to restore it. And it's in the history of Marlboro County.